What's up, horror family? It's me. I am here with another review of a horror movie that I saw recently. This time last week, I saw the horror movie called The Lodge. Um, because I'm ancient, I still get Netflix discs. So this was something that I got on a Netflix disc, and after I got it, I realized it's also streaming on Hulu. So if you have Hulu, it's there for you. Um, it's a really interesting movie. So let me say first, I went into it sort of blind without knowing a whole lot about it. I'm gonna take my glasses off because this thing is reflecting off of it. I went into it kind of blind, not knowing a lot about it. As I watched it, and then after it was over with, and I started studying it a bit more, I realized that the two people that directed the movie were also the two people that were responsible for writing the movie Goodnight Mommy, which is pretty intense too. And so you can certainly see the fingerprints of that movie in The Lodge. Well, let me start just with the basics, which is that I recommend it highly and almost unreservedly. It's a low key horror movie in the sense that it's probably not a lot like anything that you've seen, unless you've seen Goodnight Mommy, which sort of traffics in the same kind of visual horror, the building of dread, and just fucking with you in your sense of what's real and what's not real. That's the cornerstone of this movie, is what's real and what's not real. And the basic premise of it is pretty simple. It's about a fractured family. So these two kids and this dad. The dad's getting a divorce from the mother. The kids are really upset about that. I'm not going to give a whole lot away, although there's something pretty dramatic and major that happens really in the first 15 minutes of the movie, which I don't want to get into because it's a big part of it. But this dad is trying to integrate this new woman into his life and trying to get his kids to accept her and trying to bring all of them together. And there's a lot of moving pieces there because the kids are having different stages of grief about the dissolving of one family, grief about their dad moving on to this other family, other kinds of layers of grief. And then, by the way, shout out to Alicia Silverstone, who plays the mom in this movie. Is just a bit part, and she's not in it a whole lot. But we were watching, we're like, holy shit, was that Alicia Silverstone? She still got it. And anyway, that's the kind of psychological underpinnings of this movie. Is you've got all of these people that are experiencing disconnection and dissolution and grief. The woman that the father's trying to bring into the family has her own issues, her own set of grief, her own backstory. There's a really interesting critique of the academy because the dad is part of this. I would say maybe he's a social scientist who I don't know how he got through IRB, because some of the ways that he interacts with the people that he's studying is suspicious. And as an academic, I'm like, well, if I was on that IRB committee, I'd be shutting that shit down. Anyway, not to give too much away, but the movie starts to hinge on this question of like, how do you process grief? How do you move on? What is acceptable in your grief? What is not acceptable in your grief? How do you share your grief? How does grief make us isolated? How does it, bridge? What kind of communities does it make? And then it gets really, really intense. There are some physical elements that get turned up to 11. There's some psychological elements and emotional elements that get turned up to 11. There's a lot about isolation. And I remember turning to Miranda at one point, we were watching it, and saying, this is like psychological torture porn. Torture porn would be like Hostel or Wolf Creek or any of those movies where people are just physically wounded over and over and over again, and there's that sort of soft celebration of the wounding and the probing of that wound. And here it is the purposeful psychological wounding and the over and over that probing of that psychological wound, and it opening and the chasms that come from that, the grief that comes from that, the pain, the anger, the frustration, the sadness. And it's pretty intense. By the time you get to the end of it, you've really experienced a lot of what the characters are experiencing, and you go along for that ride. And it's it's pretty rough. It's a pretty rough ride. But like Hereditary, I mean, it reminds me so much of Ari Aster and Hereditary or Midsommar. Like those movies, the horror comes from that kind of element of very real human emotions or very real human needs that when they're manipulated or when they are starved or when they are turned up to 11, what kind of horrors get unleashed. So The Lodge is a really great example of that kind of movie, which I really think is kind of the new direction a lot of horror is going, that Ari Aster direction of horror, of dread, of what comes from humans when these very real emotions get toxic. And it feels like a prescient kind of horror, given what's going on in the country right now, and thinking about all of those things. These emotions that we have that are real, these feelings that we have that are based on actual disenfranchisement and horror and virus and all of these things. They're real, but when you give in to them, what do they give you permission to do? So if you are interested in taking a deep dive into something dark like that right now, and I know that maybe you're not because you don't want to handle that, you're sort of living in your own horror movie, totally fair. But if you do, it's a really good movie, and I think it'll stand the test of time for a bit because of that. Okay, that's my review then of The Lodge. Go check it out if you get a chance. Hope everybody's doing okay. I'll come back and do a couple more of these pretty soon. I'm sure I try and watch at least one every week and keep you guys updated. Stay scary. Bye, guys.